The land of North Dakota, stretching far beyond the plains and deep into the snow-capped forests, holds a sense of mystery that no modern traveler can truly understand. It's a place where time feels as though it has slowed, where the wind speaks in whispers, and the trees stand as silent witnesses to a history far older than the one written in textbooks. But what many fail to grasp is that beneath the quiet exterior of this seemingly untouched wilderness lies a deep and untold truth, one that I learned the hard way. I've lived a life on the edge. Born into a family of hunters and explorers, I was raised to appreciate the land, to learn its signs, and to respect the forces that governed it. My youth was filled with the thrill of exploring forests, tracking animals, and camping under the vast skies that stretched endlessly across the American West. But none of that prepared me for the terror I would witness in 1986. Back then, I was just a man with an insatiable curiosity, always searching for the unknown. Little did I know that what I was about to uncover would change my understanding of the world, and of death itself, forever. It all began with the disappearance of a group of 5 hikers who ventured into the North Dakota wilderness. They were young, adventurous souls, hoping to experience the raw beauty of the land, to walk where few dared tread. They had no idea that their lives would become entwined with a history much darker than any of them could have imagined. As a former hunter, I was contacted by local authorities when their bodies were discovered. The situation was far beyond the scope of typical investigations. These were not simple hikers who had succumbed to the dangers of nature. Their deaths were far more gruesome and inexplicable. Mutilated bodies, unexplained markings on trees, and bloodstains that led to nowhere. All of it painted a picture of something far more sinister than a bear attack or a freak accident. The locals, mostly Native American tribes who lived in the area, were tight-lipped about the incident. They had their own legends, old stories passed down from generation to generation. Stories of vengeful spirits, guardians of the land, who could strike at any time to punish those who dared to trespass on sacred ground. But these were just stories, right? At least, that's what I thought at the time. I was a man of logic and reason, not superstition. I remember walking into the village of a nearby tribe, a place that had stood for centuries, untouched by the outside world. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words. The old men, their faces marked by the wrinkles of time, looked at me with eyes that seemed to know something I didn't. They didn't speak of the hikers' deaths, at least not openly. They looked at me with a sort of quiet pity, as if I were about to make a mistake that would cost me more than I could imagine. At the time, I thought they were just a superstitious people, clinging to outdated beliefs. But I would soon learn that I was the one who had been blinded by arrogance. The investigation into the hikers' deaths led me deeper into the wilderness. I began to track their last known movements, piecing together the final hours of their journey. What I uncovered was a trail that led to a place none of them should have ventured, a secluded area known only to the local tribes, a place steeped in ancient rituals and forbidden practices. It was a place known as the Whispering Hollow, a name that struck me as strange at the time. It was said that those who entered would hear voices, calls from the past, whispers from spirits who had long since passed from this world. I never took these tales seriously. The Whispering Hollow was just a part of folklore, at least, that's what I believed. But as I traced the hikers' steps, as I entered the depths of the forest and found myself surrounded by trees that seemed to close in around me, I started to feel it, the unease. The air became thick and heavy, and the forest, once full of life and movement, felt eerily still. I found the hikers' camp, or what was left of it. Their tents were slashed open, their gear scattered around like they had been attacked. But there were no signs of struggle, no tracks to indicate what had happened. There were only strange markings, symbols drawn in the snow, carved into trees. Some were familiar to me, others completely foreign. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine as I studied them. These weren't just random marks, they were deliberate, ritualistic. The further I dug into the history of the land, the more I uncovered. The tribe that lived nearby had long believed that the land was protected by something much older than their people. A force, a spirit, that had existed long before their ancestors walked on this land. They called it the Watcher, a being that could take many forms but was most often seen as a shadow in the trees, an indistinct figure that moved just out of sight. The Watcher was said to guard the land fiercely, punishing anyone who violated the sacred places with brutal and often fatal retribution. I hadn't believed in the Watcher before. I didn't think I had to, but as I walked through the forest, following the hikers' final trail, I began to question everything. The markings on the trees, the strange silence that enveloped me, the feeling of being watched. It all began to make sense in a way that terrified me. And then I found it, the entrance to the Whispering Hollow. I knew I had made a terrible mistake. As I ventured deeper into the wilds of North Dakota, the landscape began to shift, becoming increasingly untamed and hostile. The trees, once familiar and comforting, began to take on a darker, more oppressive form, their gnarled branches twisting in unnatural angles. The wind had a mournful howl, a constant reminder that this was no longer a place for mere mortals to wander without consequence. The land felt ancient, as if it had been waiting for something or someone to cross its boundary. And I had crossed it. The further I walked into the Whispering Hollow, the more disconnected I felt from the world I knew. The air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding weighed heavily on me. The forest, which had once seemed so alive, now felt suffocating, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't just the landscape that felt different, but everything, my thoughts, my senses, even the very ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. The once familiar world I knew, the world of reason, logic, and evidence, had been replaced by something intangible, something that felt ancient and alive. In those moments, I wasn't just an investigator. I was a trespasser. I wasn't alone. I never had been. At first, I didn't recognize the significance of the Watcher. The stories from the Native American elders had been just that, stories. Tall tales passed down to frightened children and newcomers. The idea of a spirit guarding the land seemed laughable to me. A man who had spent his life hunting, tracking, and investigating the most brutal and grotesque crimes. A spirit? That was no match for the hardened resolve I had cultivated over the years. Or so I thought. The Watcher was a legend, yes, but legends, as I would soon learn, were rooted in something far more terrifying than myth. The more I spent in the forest, the more I began to understand. It wasn't just a spirit. It was something far older, something tied to the land itself. The elders spoke of it as if it were alive, a sentient presence that watched over the sacred places. Some claimed it could take human form. Others said it was a shapeshifter, an entity that could change its appearance at will. What remained constant was its connection to the land, its undeniable ability to sense when its boundaries were being violated. As I pressed on, I recalled the hikers, 5 young souls who had been drawn into this wild place, seemingly without understanding the dangers that lay in wait. They had been like me, curious, adventurous, ignorant of the ancient forces that govern this land. They didn't know what they were walking into, and in the end, it cost them their lives. But it wasn't just the Watcher that claimed them. There was something else, something that even the land seemed to fear. The hikers had followed the same path I was now walking. They had pitched their tents near the Whispering Hollow and begun to explore, not understanding what they had disturbed. At first, it seemed like any other adventure. They hiked through the forest, camped near the river, but as the days passed, things began to change. They felt the weight of the land pressing in on them, the silence growing unbearable. One by one, they started to feel as though they were being watched. The air seemed to thicken, and the whispers in the wind became more distinct, like voices calling to them from the shadows. I could feel it now too, the eyes of the land upon me, the ever-present sensation of being watched. But as I walked deeper, the whispers began to grow louder, and the land seemed to shift. The trees no longer looked like trees. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the sounds of the forest faded into a silence that was deafening. I had crossed over into something beyond my understanding, and I could feel the weight of it, the pull of the land, the presence of something ancient, something waiting. I had seen death before, more times than I cared to admit. I had tracked down criminals, uncovered dark secrets, and faced danger at every turn. But this was different. This wasn't a crime scene or an investigation. This was something primal, something that had existed long before mankind had learned to walk upright. The Watcher was not a being that could be understood by logic or reason. It was an embodiment of the land, a creature woven into the very fabric of this place. It was an ancient force that didn't just guard its territory, it was its territory. The land was its soul, and it had been here long before any human stepped foot in these forests. As I delved deeper into the hollow, I began to unravel the truth. The hikers had disturbed the sacred land, and the Watcher had taken its revenge. But it wasn't just a force of nature, it was something more. It was tied to the land itself, feeding off the fear of those who dared to trespass. The land had been waiting for centuries for someone like me, someone who would dare to challenge it. But it was more than just the Watcher. There was something else, something darker, something far more ancient. The Watcher wasn't the only force that inhabited these woods. As I walked deeper, I began to feel the presence of others, an overwhelming sense of being surrounded by countless unseen eyes. The trees, the rocks, the very earth beneath my feet, they were alive with something primal. The air seemed thick with malice, with a malevolent intent that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the Watcher I was dealing with. It was the land itself, and the land had no mercy. The moment I set foot on the land, I could sense something was wrong. The trees, towering and ominous, cast long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, creeping across the forest floor as if reaching for me. The air felt thick with an unspoken tension, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was an unsettling feeling, one I couldn't shake. As a seasoned explorer, I had faced dangerous wildlife, harsh terrain, and the unpredictability of nature, but this was different. This was something darker. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I couldn't help but remember the stories, the eerie accounts of missing hikers, and the inexplicable deaths in the North Dakota Native American lands. In 1986, 5 hikers had entered these very woods, only to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only a handful of disturbing clues. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it was the one that had haunted the locals the most. People said it was the work of the Watcher, a mythical figure that was said to guard the sacred land, punishing anyone who dared to trespass. I had heard the rumors, of course, but rumors are just that, stories passed down through generations. I wasn't one to believe in old legends or superstitions. I was a practical man, a man of reason and evidence. I had to see it for myself. The idea of the Watcher, an ancient being that could take human form or shapeshift, seemed laughable. Yet, the more I walked, the more I began to question that certainty. The forest seemed to shift around me, as if it was trying to conceal something just beyond my perception. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the signs became. There were no sounds of animals or birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind. It was an unnatural silence, one that made my nerves tingle with unease. And then I began to see them, scratches on the trees, gouges so deep they had torn through the bark, exposing the raw flesh of the wood beneath. The marks were fresh, the edges sharp and jagged, as though something had raked its claws through the trunks in anger. They were everywhere, marking a path deeper into the forest. I tried to dismiss them as just the random damage from a wild animal, but something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. These marks felt deliberate, and they felt personal. By the time I reached the clearing where the hikers had camped in 1986, I felt like I was walking in their footsteps, retracing the last moments of their lives. The forest here was dense, but the trees were oddly spaced, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The ground was uneven, soft with layers of moss, and the air had a palpable weight, as though the place itself was burdened with history. It was no wonder the hikers had come to this spot. On the surface, it seemed peaceful, serene even. But something dark lurked beneath, something I couldn't quite grasp, no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it. The remains of their campfire were still there, though it had long since been extinguished. A few charred logs, the outlines of their tents now faded and worn by time. But the most disturbing thing was the smell. It wasn't the usual scent of damp earth or decaying leaves that filled the air. There was something else, something metallic, almost chemical. And it wasn't just the scent of death. It was the scent of fear, of something that had been consumed by terror. I could almost hear their screams echoing in my mind. The hikers' final moments, their panic as they realized they were being hunted, tracked by something far beyond their understanding. The last person to survive, a woman named Sarah, had written in her journal that the forest had come alive, that the trees themselves had moved, and that something was watching them. She spoke of whispers in the night, of eyes in the shadows that followed their every step. The others had laughed it off, assuming it was the result of exhaustion or fear. But then one by one they disappeared. The last entry in Sarah's journal was a frantic scrawl, asterisk, "It's coming for me. I can hear it. I see its eyes. I am not alone. It knows we're here. Asterisk." Her words lingered in my mind as I knelt by the remnants of the camp. It was then that I noticed the scratches, the same gouges I had seen on the trees. They were on the rocks here, too, as if something had clawed at them in rage. And there were footprints, human footprints, but they were distorted, misshapen, as if the person had been dragged or forced to walk in an unnatural way. The prints didn't belong to any animal I knew. They were too large, too deep, too precise. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The forest seemed to shift around me again, and I could swear I heard something move in the trees. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. No animal, no figure, no sign of anything except the oppressive silence. I was alone, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't. That's when I heard it, whispers. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of wind through the leaves. But soon they grew louder, more distinct, as if they were coming from the very trees themselves. Words, unintelligible but unmistakable. And then I saw them, the eyes. Not human, not animal, but something in between. They glowed faintly in the shadows, blinking slowly, tracking my every move. It was then that I understood. The Watcher had been watching me all along. As I stood there, the weight of the forest pressing in around me, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from all directions, flitting between the trees, dancing on the edges of my consciousness. They weren't just random sounds, they were deliberate, calling to me. At that moment, I realized I wasn't alone in this narrative. The stories I'd heard growing up, the legends that had always seemed so distant, were no longer a matter of belief or disbelief. They were alive. But as the whispers grew louder, another thought crossed my mind: Sarah. The last hiker to survive. Had she seen the same things I was seeing now? Had she felt the same presence, the same suffocating weight of being watched? There was a disconnect between what I knew and what I felt in that moment. The logical side of me, the investigator, told me to stay calm and rationalize what was happening. Yet, every instinct in my body screamed that this was something far beyond explanation, beyond reason. The subplots of the story, the separate threads that intertwined into the present, had started to take shape in my mind. The hikers from 1986, each one a character with their own motivations, backgrounds, and experiences, had unknowingly set the stage for this encounter. Their tragic fate had left a scar on the land, one that seemed to have seeped into every corner of the forest. Their deaths weren't just a random occurrence. They were part of a larger, more complex story, one that I was now a part of. It wasn't just the Watcher who loomed over the events. It was the history of the land itself, the native tribes that had once called this place home. Their beliefs and customs, their connection to the land, were part of the fabric that had woven this tragedy together. I had been taught in school about the ancient rituals and spiritual practices of the indigenous people who had lived in North Dakota. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality that was unfolding before me now. The native tribes had always spoken of the guardians, beings who were said to protect sacred lands, ensuring that those who trespassed would face consequences. Some believed the guardians were spirits, while others thought they were manifestations of the land itself, creatures born from the earth's oldest, most primal forces. The Watcher was one such guardian, a being that lived in the shadows, keeping an eye on the land and punishing anyone who dared disturb it. The hikers in 1986, according to some reports, had unknowingly broken the sacred rules of the land. They had wandered too deep into the forest, where the Watcher had claimed them. The tragedy of those hikers wasn't just their deaths, it was the underlying reason for their fate. They had been ignorant, like I had been, about the deeper forces at play in the forest. They hadn't respected the warnings, hadn't acknowledged the ancient history of the land. They had walked in with open eyes but blind hearts. And now, as I stood in the same place they had stood, I understood. It wasn't enough to simply exist in these wild places. You had to respect them, and I had made the same mistake they had. But there was more. The whispers weren't just warnings, they were a call. Something was happening in the forest, something that had been brewing for years. The Watcher wasn't acting alone. There were others, perhaps creatures born of the land's darkest, most forgotten corners. The gouges on the trees, the strange, misshapen footprints, they were evidence of something far more complex than a simple guardian. The Watcher was part of a much older and more dangerous narrative. The land was not only a place of reverence, it was a battleground. And the Watcher was fighting a war that no one but the land's oldest beings understood. I tried to focus on the facts, to separate the myths from reality. The pieces began to fit together in a way that made my skin crawl. Sarah's final journal entry had mentioned the eyes, the presence that had stalked them through the night. I thought back to the marks, the footprints, the strange phenomena. They weren't random. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth. This wasn't just a forest haunted by spirits. It was a living, breathing entity, engaged in a war that had been fought for centuries. The Watcher was simply a soldier, one of many, doing its part in this ancient conflict. But there were other complexities. As I moved deeper into the woods, I began to realize something else. Sarah's fate hadn't been sealed by the Watcher alone. There were forces at play that I hadn't fully understood. The hikers had been slaughtered, but they had also unwittingly been part of something much larger than themselves. They had awakened something in the land, a force that had been dormant for years. The Watcher wasn't just a guardian of the forest. It was a protector of an ancient secret, one that had been hidden for generations. The deaths of the hikers were only the beginning. The land had claimed them, but it wasn't done yet. The force that had come alive in the wake of their deaths was now reaching out, extending its grasp. It had felt me, had sensed my presence, and now it wanted me. I had become part of the story, another thread in a tapestry of tragedy and vengeance. But this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the forest, about the Watcher, and about the history that had been forgotten for too long. The stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. The Watcher was no longer just an ancient guardian. It was part of something much darker, a force that would stop at nothing to ensure that its secrets remained buried. And the clock was ticking. The deeper I went, the closer I got to uncovering the truth. But also, the closer I came to the terrifying consequences of knowing too much. As I trudged deeper into the wilderness, the air grew denser, heavier, thick with an oppressive silence that seemed unnatural. The trees, towering and ancient, bent toward one another as if they were closing in on me, narrowing my path. I had been in plenty of forests before, but nothing like this. The land felt alive, its pulse steady and unyielding, the rustling of leaves now eerily synchronized with my every step. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me. This wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a sentience that watched me, calculated my every move. The temperature dropped as twilight crept in, and the forest seemed to hum with an unsettling energy. The whispers from earlier had quieted, but they had not disappeared. Instead, they shifted, becoming more distinct, more pronounced. They weren't just sounds now. They were words, fragmented and foreign, like a language I could almost understand but couldn't quite grasp. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to me. I paused, adjusting the strap of my pack, my breath misting in the cold air. The day had passed quickly, and I hadn't thought to set up camp. But the longer I lingered, the more I felt the pressure of something closing in around me. It wasn't the landscape anymore. It was something much more sinister, something I couldn't see but could feel in my bones. That's when I heard it, movement behind me, a shift in the air, a footstep. Instinctively, I spun around, hand reaching for my sidearm, but the forest was empty. No figure, no shadow, nothing but the whispering wind. My heart raced, adrenaline surging as my thoughts scrambled for an explanation. A branch breaking? A deer? Yet deep down, I knew it wasn't something as innocent as an animal. No, this was something else entirely. Something deliberate. I wasn't alone, and whatever it was, it had been following me for a while. The creeping sensation grew more intense, the air thick with tension, and I instinctively reached for my flashlight. Its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a small clearing ahead. That's when I saw it. Something massive, glistening in the light, almost like a reflection. A pool of water, black as ink, sat in the middle of the clearing. But it wasn't the water that caught my attention. It was the object next to it. There, beside the pool, half buried in the earth, lay an old, weathered book. The cover was cracked and peeling, but the faint markings of symbols were still visible. It seemed out of place in the wilderness, too deliberate, too ancient. A chill ran down my spine as I took a cautious step forward, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt beside it, flipping the book open. The pages were filled with strange, jagged symbols, half readable as if the language was shifting on the paper. Some pages were stained, others charred. The writing seemed to change under the light, twisting and contorting, as if it were alive. A heavy scent filled the air as I turned the pages, like burning wood mixed with something fouler, more decayed. Suddenly, the air around me seemed to shift again, heavier than before. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath forming in the air. I looked up, eyes darting around the clearing. That's when I saw it. The trees on the edge of the clearing had stopped moving. It was as though they had frozen in place, their gnarled branches reaching toward me like outstretched arms. In the shadows of the trees, I thought I saw a shape, a figure watching me. My hand instinctively went to my weapon, but my fingers trembled. A cold, guttural growl vibrated through the earth, sending a wave of fear crashing over me. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and in that moment, everything clicked. The legends, the whispers, the hikers who had disappeared, all of it was connected. The Watcher, the creatures of the forest. They weren't just stories. They were real, and I had stumbled into their domain. Then a voice, not a whisper, but clear as day. "You shouldn't have come." I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the clearing. I whipped around, but there was no one. Yet, I could feel the presence of something, a force in the air. The weight of it was crushing, like being under a mountain, unable to move or escape. A shadow moved at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a human figure, not in the sense that I understood. It was something else. Tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs, like a creature made of shadows, coiling and shifting in the darkness. The thing didn't walk, it drifted, its form twisting in ways that defied logic. It was the Watcher, the entity that had been guarding this place for centuries. I felt the ground beneath me give way as the creature stepped forward, its presence swallowing the air. I stumbled back, heart racing. The creature didn't speak, its gaze was enough. It didn't need words to convey its purpose. It was ancient, primal, and it had been waiting for me, for someone like me to trespass. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices echoing through the trees. And then, in the blink of an eye, the creature lunged, its form blurring into something monstrous, its claws outstretched. Everything went dark. In that moment, I understood the truth. The deaths from years ago, the horror of the hikers, Sarah's warnings, it was all part of a larger, ancient pattern. The Watcher wasn't just a protector. It was an avenger, a force that punished anyone who dared to disrupt the sanctity of this land. And I had become another casualty in its long history of vengeance. When I woke, I was alone in the clearing, the book still in my hand. The creatures, the shadows, they were gone. But something had changed. I had changed. The forest was still alive, still watching. And I knew then that I had only scratched the surface of something far darker, far older, than I could ever understand. The turning point had come, and there was no turning back. When I woke up, the world had changed in ways I couldn't comprehend. The pain in my skull was sharp, a constant reminder of the terror I'd experienced. I felt disoriented, as though I had been ripped from one reality and dropped into another. The forest, now bathed in the pale light of early morning, seemed eerily calm, yet there was a tangible weight in the air, a heavy silence that hung around me like a shroud. I had no memory of how I'd gotten here, no sense of time passing. My body ached all over, and my hands were trembling uncontrollably. The book, still clutched tightly in my grip, was warm to the touch, as if it had absorbed the essence of the forest itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was alive, that it had been watching me in the same way the shadows had. The eerie silence of the wilderness was unsettling, like a predator waiting for its next move. I stood shakily, struggling to get my bearings, my breath coming in shallow bursts. It took several minutes for my senses to return to me, and as I scanned my surroundings, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Everything was still, unnaturally still. The wind that had been whispering through the trees earlier was now gone. The branches hung motionless, their gnarled shapes twisted and unnatural. The forest had closed in on me, trapping me in its dark heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was no physical presence, but I felt it. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was no longer alone. It was as if the very forest had become a part of me, entwining its secrets with my thoughts, tightening its grip with every passing second. My instincts screamed for me to leave, to run far and fast, but something rooted me to the spot, something deeper, something stronger than my desire for survival. Then I remembered the creature, the Watcher, the thing that had stalked me in the shadows. It hadn't just been a figment of my imagination. It had been real. Its presence was not just an illusion. It was an entity, older than the land itself, a protector of some unknown boundary that I had crossed. I wasn't just a trespasser. I was an intruder into something ancient, something beyond my understanding. My heart pounded, panic beginning to rise in my chest. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. The memory of its cold gaze, the way it had loomed over me, still haunted me. I took a hesitant step forward, but the ground beneath me felt unfamiliar, almost foreign. The path I had followed before was gone, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. The deeper I ventured, the stranger things became. The trees, once towering and solid, now seemed to shift, bending and warping in ways that didn't make sense. I couldn't trust my eyes. Nothing felt real anymore. I moved faster, desperation setting in, but the forest didn't relent. It closed in around me, twisting and turning in impossible directions. As the hours passed, I began to lose my sense of direction. I couldn't tell if I was heading in a straight line or spiraling deeper into the heart of the wilderness. My mind was unraveling, the fatigue, fear, and confusion taking their toll. Every step seemed to bring me farther from safety, and yet, the pull of the forest was undeniable. I had become a part of its rhythm, a mere puppet in its ancient dance. I stumbled into a clearing, and that's when I saw it, tall, dark figures standing among the trees. They weren't human. Their limbs were long and twisted, their features too distorted to make sense of. Shadows swirled around them, cloaking their forms in an eerie, otherworldly glow. The Watcher was among them, its form more monstrous than I had remembered. It was larger now, its limbs stretching toward the sky, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I froze, unable to look away. The creatures didn't move, but I could feel them in my bones. Their presence was suffocating, like the very air was being sucked out of me. The forest had come alive, not with life, but with something far darker. It was as if the land itself had awakened, and I was its prey. A low growl echoed from the trees, and the creatures began to move, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring my terror. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the earth warping as if it, too, was alive. Panic seized my chest, and I turned to run, but I couldn't escape. Every direction led to more trees, more shadows, and more figures. I wasn't just lost, I was trapped. Trapped in a nightmare with no way out. My mind raced for answers, but there were none to find. I had crossed into the realm of something beyond human understanding. The deaths of the hikers, the stories of the Watcher, they weren't just folklore. They were warnings, tales meant to keep people like me out of this cursed land. I had ignored them, and now, I would pay the price. As the creatures encircled me, I knew there was no escaping this fate. The forest had claimed me, and I was no different from those who had come before. The Watcher had seen to that. The darkness that had once been a mere shadow now seemed to swallow me whole, and I was powerless to resist. I had come seeking answers, seeking truth. But in the end, the only truth I had found was that some places are never meant to be uncovered, some mysteries too dangerous to solve. And I had become the next chapter in a story that had been unfolding long before I set foot on this cursed land. The forest had spoken, and its judgment was final. As I stood frozen in the clearing, encircled by those twisted creatures, I realized I had made a grave mistake. The weight of that realization felt like a suffocating cloud, pressing down on me until I could hardly breathe. For the first time since I had arrived, fear wasn't the only thing consuming me. There was something else, something deeper, regret. Regret for not listening to the warnings, regret for not taking seriously the stories of the Watcher, of those lost hikers. They had been right all along. But in that moment, when escape seemed impossible, I felt something else stir within me, something unfamiliar, something I hadn't felt in years. It was the instinct to fight, to survive. I'd spent years navigating some of the world's most hostile environments as a hunter and explorer. I knew how to push past fear, how to find a way out when there was no clear path. It was time to tap into that part of myself again. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I had to focus, to think clearly. The creatures were closing in, their hollow eyes glimmering with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring my fear, savoring the moment. But in that moment of clarity, I realized something vital. They weren't as fast as I was. They weren't human. They were creatures of the forest, bound to the land by ancient forces that I didn't fully understand. They didn't have the agility or the experience to track, to hunt like I did. It was time to use what I knew. I quickly scanned my surroundings. The clearing, once vast and open, now felt like a cage. The tall figures of the creatures were closing in from every direction, but I noticed something. The trees, dark and twisted, lined the perimeter, their trunks covered with dense moss. There was one particular tree to my left that had a hollow at its base, just big enough for me to squeeze into. The creatures didn't seem to notice it at first, distracted by the steady approach toward me. I took a calculated risk. I bolted, sprinting as fast as I could toward the tree. The brush whipped at my skin, the sound of my heavy breathing drowning out everything else. I could feel the creatures' gaze on my back, their unnatural eyes boring into me, but I didn't dare look. There was no time. The hollow was close. It was small, but I was desperate. I reached the tree and dove for the opening. My chest slammed into the cold ground as I shoved my body into the hollow, my limbs scraping against the rough bark. It was tight, uncomfortably so, but it offered me the smallest chance of survival. I pulled my legs in, tucking my arms to my chest as I heard the creatures' footsteps draw nearer. I was invisible now, hidden from their view, but the danger was far from over. The forest wasn't finished with me yet. Inside the hollow, my mind raced. I could hear the creatures growling softly, their deep, guttural voices echoing through the trees. They were searching for me now, pacing around the clearing, their twisted forms moving with terrifying precision. I fought to keep my breathing steady, to remain as silent as possible. My body trembled with adrenaline, my heart hammering against my ribcage. I couldn't stay here forever. The hollow wouldn't protect me for long. I had to keep moving, to find a way to escape the grip of this cursed land. I had to do what I did best, outlast, outsmart, and survive. The moments dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours. But gradually, the creatures began to retreat. I could hear their footsteps growing fainter, their calls becoming more distant. Had they given up? I couldn't be sure, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I slowly began to extricate myself from the hollow, careful not to make any noise. The moment I was free, I sprinted again, weaving through the trees with newfound determination. I didn't know if I was headed in the right direction, but I had to trust my instincts. I had survived this far. There had to be a way out. As I ran, the weight of the forest seemed to press in around me, the trees bending and twisting as though they were trying to trap me once more. But something had changed. The creatures, the watcher, the land itself, they no longer held the same power over me. I had faced them, stared into the abyss, and had come out the other side. I wasn't the same man who had walked into this forest a day ago. I had been forced to confront my own limitations, my own fear, and in doing so, I had become stronger. I wasn't just running from the creatures anymore. I was running toward something, toward freedom, toward survival, toward the truth. And I knew that no matter what happened, I would make it out of this place. I had to. After what felt like an eternity, I finally stumbled upon the edge of the forest. The trees began to thin, and I could see the faint outline of the mountains in the distance. The air felt different now, cleaner, fresher. The oppressive weight of the forest seemed to lift, and I dared to hope that I had made it out. But even as I took my first steps towards safety, I couldn't forget what I had experienced in that cursed land. I knew the Watcher and the creatures were still out there, waiting, guarding the secrets of the forest. I had escaped, but I wasn't the same. The world had changed, and so had I. I had faced death and survived. But in doing so, I had uncovered something far darker, something far older, than I ever could have imagined. And that knowledge would haunt me for the rest of my life. The forest had shown me its power, and it was clear, nothing, not even the fiercest of men, could truly escape its grasp. The days since I had escaped the first encounter with the creatures in the forest had felt like an eternity. I had spent the time regrouping, physically and mentally, as I tried to make sense of the horrors I had witnessed. Each passing moment felt like it was dragging me closer to an inevitable confrontation, a final reckoning with whatever dark force had taken hold of the land. The forest, once a place I had respected, had now become a place of nightmares. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was alive, watching, waiting. The Watcher, the mysterious entity that had haunted the woods, had made its presence known to me in ways I couldn't fully explain. And the creatures? They were its servants, twisted reflections of something ancient and vile. I couldn't let them have the final say. I couldn't let them claim another life. I had to return to the heart of the forest, confront the source of this madness, and make sure that no one else would suffer the same fate as the hikers who had disappeared all those years ago. I had learned enough by now to know that my previous strategy of avoidance wasn't going to work. Running and hiding, no matter how skilled I was, wouldn't get me out of this alive. I had to face what was out there, head on. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed allies, real, solid people who could help me navigate the forest and fight back if necessary. But I had no one to turn to. Most of the rangers had heard my story, but they either didn't believe it or were too frightened to do anything. The local authorities were just as useless. This was a problem I had to solve on my own. So, I began my preparations. The first task was securing supplies. I raided the old ranger station where I had previously worked, gathering everything I could: survival gear, food rations, water purifiers, and a collection of tools. But what I truly needed was information, a deeper understanding of what had happened in this place and how to stop it. There was one place I hadn't yet explored: the caves. The locals had always spoken of the caves as if they were cursed, as if they had a mind of their own. The caves were said to be where the first hikers had gone missing, where the creatures had emerged from the darkness. I had to know if the caves were the true heart of the evil that plagued this land. But accessing them wouldn't be easy. The entrance was hidden deep within the forest, far from any established trail, and I had to be sure that I was prepared for what lay ahead. The second task was mental preparation. I had faced danger before: wild animals, extreme weather, hostile terrain. But this was different. This wasn't nature at its most dangerous. This was something beyond understanding, something that defied the laws of reality itself. The fear that gripped me every time I thought about returning to the forest was like nothing I had ever known. I had to fight that fear. I had to learn how to embrace it, how to use it to fuel my determination, rather than let it paralyze me. I spent hours at the ranger station, poring over maps and reports, trying to gather any piece of information that might give me an advantage. I knew that the creatures were no ordinary predators. They were more like ghosts, shadows that moved with unnatural precision, as if they could track your every move without you even realizing it. Their ability to sense fear, to use it against you, was perhaps the most terrifying thing I had encountered. I couldn't let them get inside my head again. The final preparation was my weaponry. I had access to firearms, but I knew that bullets wouldn't stop the creatures. They had somehow survived centuries, if not millennia, in the forest. I needed something stronger, something that could truly fight back against whatever dark forces controlled them. I gathered every item I thought might help: a flare gun, fire-starting materials, and most importantly, salt. According to the old local legends, salt was said to have power over spirits, to purify and ward off the evil that lingered in the woods. I didn't know how much truth there was in those stories, but I wasn't about to leave anything to chance. If the locals were right, the salt might be my best chance of survival. As the sun began to set, I knew it was time. I had prepared as much as I could. The fear still lingered in the back of my mind, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't afford to let it control me. I had a purpose now, to end this nightmare, to make sure no one else would fall victim to the creatures lurking in the shadows of the forest. I set out just as darkness was falling, walking into the woods with a sense of finality. This was it. I was going to face whatever haunted this land, whatever had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about closure, about ending the terror that had been unleashed all those years ago. I walked with purpose, the forest alive around me, the sound of branches snapping in the distance reminding me that I was not alone. The path grew steeper as I made my way toward the caves. The air felt heavier now, charged with an almost oppressive energy. I could feel the weight of the Watcher's presence hanging over me. Every step forward was a battle, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. I wasn't just fighting for my life. I was fighting for the memory of those lost hikers, for the families who never had answers, for the land itself. As I approached the cave entrance, the air grew colder. The shadows seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally toward me, as if trying to reach out and pull me into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, staring into the blackness, knowing that whatever happened next would determine the fate of not just me, but of the land itself. It was time to confront the evil that had haunted the forest for so long. The darkness of the cave swallowed me whole as I stepped inside, my heart racing. The cold air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint sound of my footsteps echoing off the damp stone walls. I tightened my grip on the flare gun, the only weapon that had any hope of making a difference. The salt sat heavy in my backpack, its significance now beyond mere superstition. This was no ordinary cave. It was a place of power, a threshold between the known world and something much darker. I had only just begun to walk deeper into the cave when I heard the faintest whisper. It was a breath, a hiss that sent a shiver down my spine. My skin prickled as if something unseen was standing just behind me. I stopped, holding my breath, straining my ears to catch any further sound. The whisper came again, louder this time, but it wasn't a human voice. It was a low, guttural growl, as if the earth itself was speaking to me. I knew then that I was not alone. I spun around, flare gun raised, ready for whatever was coming, but the cave was empty. Only the shadows stretched around me, twisting like living things, mocking my every move. I was in the heart of the forest's nightmare, and it was watching me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to flee, but I couldn't. I had come too far. I had no choice but to face whatever horrors waited in the dark. Then, from the depths of the cave, came a sound like the scraping of metal on stone, sharp and piercing. It was followed by another, and then another, closer this time. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively took a step back, my eyes scanning the darkness. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating, as if the cave itself was trying to crush the breath out of me. My hand trembled as I gripped the flare gun tighter, my fingers slick with sweat despite the cold. I had seen the creatures before, but nothing could have prepared me for what emerged from the shadows. It wasn't just one. It was a mass of writhing shapes, their forms indistinct at first, like dark tendrils of smoke or fog. But as they moved closer, I saw them clearly, twisted skeletal figures with eyes that glowed a sickly green, their bodies bent at unnatural angles, as if they had been warped by something far more malevolent than nature. They moved without sound, their limbs long and gaunt, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. I knew instantly that these were the creatures I had feared, the ones that had killed the hikers in 1986, the ones that had been stalking me since I arrived. I raised the flare gun and fired. The flare shot out with a brilliant, blinding light, streaking through the darkness. The creatures recoiled, hissing and screeching in pain as the light bathed them. The glow from the flare illuminated their monstrous forms, but it also revealed something far worse. The cave was not just a tomb, it was a prison, and the creatures were the guardians, bound to it by forces I couldn't comprehend. One of the creatures lunged at me, its claws extended, sharp and glistening in the flare's light. I fired again, but it was too fast. It slashed across my arm, the pain searing through my veins. I stumbled backward, struggling to keep my balance, but the cave seemed to shift around me, its walls closing in. The creatures circled me, their eyes gleaming with malice as they drew closer. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fought to keep my focus, even as the pain in my arm threatened to overwhelm me. But then a memory flashed through my mind, something I had learned from the old ranger station. Salt, the ancient ritual of purification. The stories had told of its power, its ability to ward off spirits and entities, to bind them and strip them of their strength. I reached into my pack, desperate to find the salt, but the creatures were closing in. Their claws scraped the floor, and their hisses grew louder, more frenzied. I threw handfuls of salt at the nearest creature, watching in horror as the grains scattered through the air, the salt glinting in the flare's light. The creature shrieked, its body twitching as if it was burning from the inside out. I could see it, the salt was working. The creature writhed and twisted, its glowing eyes fading, its body crumbling into dust before my eyes. But there were more, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows, drawn to the scent of fear and the promise of death. I knew I couldn't fight them all. The salt might be enough to weaken them, but not to destroy them entirely. The flare's light was fading, and with it, my last chance for survival. I had one more shot, one more flare. I aimed the gun at the farthest corner of the cave, where the shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and fired. The flare exploded into the darkness, lighting up the cave with a blaze of intense, blinding light. For a moment, the creatures recoiled, their forms flickering in the light. The cave itself seemed to tremble, as if it was being torn apart by the sheer force of the flare's glow. And then, as the light faded, everything stopped. The creatures were gone. The cave was silent once more, the oppressive darkness lifting as the last remnants of the creatures disintegrated into dust. I stood there, my body aching, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. The cave was still, as if it had never been home to anything more than the earth itself. But I knew that the battle wasn't over. There were more caves in this cursed land, and I would have to keep hunting, keep fighting, until the last of them was gone. As I stumbled out of the cave, the world outside seemed brighter, the trees less threatening. But I knew better than to think that the darkness was truly gone. The Watcher still watched, the creatures still lingered in the depths. This was only the beginning. As I walked away from the cave, the bitter wind of the Alaskan wilderness biting at my exposed skin, I felt an overwhelming sense of both relief and dread. The creatures were gone, or so I thought, but something lingered in the air, an unease that wouldn't let go. Every rustling branch, every shift in the wind, seemed to whisper of something just beyond the edge of my vision, something that hadn't been entirely vanquished. I had survived, but not without cost. My arm throbbed, the gash from the creature's claws still fresh, and the deep, gnawing exhaustion weighed heavy on me. I had faced something far beyond the scope of human understanding, something that didn't belong in this world, and yet there I was, still standing. The salt, the flare, they had worked, but they were only temporary solutions to a much larger problem. I couldn't shake the feeling that the true horror wasn't over. It had only just begun. I knew that no one else could ever understand what I'd been through. The town would never hear about what I'd faced in the depths of that cave. If they did, they'd call me insane, or worse, they'd dismiss my account as the ramblings of a man who'd lost his mind in the wilderness. I was a ranger, a man who had spent years in the wild, who'd dealt with all kinds of animals, dangers, and disasters. But this was different. This was something ancient, something far more dangerous than anything the world had ever seen. In the days that followed, I tried to process everything I'd learned. I could barely sleep without the visions of those creatures clawing their way back into my mind. The faces of the lost hikers from years ago haunted me, their final screams echoing in my ears. I knew the stories now, what had happened to them, why they had vanished, and who or what was responsible. And though I had returned to my camp with the flare gun empty and my backpack stripped of the salt, I knew that the Alaskan wilderness had more secrets to reveal. My mission was incomplete. The creatures weren't all gone, and the darkness I'd uncovered was only a small piece of the puzzle. I had to go back. The Alaskan wilderness is vast, unforgiving, and full of untold dangers, but there's a part of me, something deep within, that calls me back, that urges me to finish what I started. The creatures I'd fought were only the beginning, a mere glimpse into a world that existed long before mankind set foot on these lands. The stories of the Watcher, the curse of the cave, they were just fragments of something far older, far darker. I can't rest until I've destroyed what's left of them. I won't let them claim another soul. But as I prepare for my next journey into the depths of the wild, I can't help but wonder, how much longer will I be able to keep them at bay? How much longer will I survive before the darkness finally claims me too? And so, I will continue, until there's nothing left of the creatures, nothing left of the darkness, until the wilderness is finally, completely at peace. But even as I step back into the unknown, a small part of me knows, I will never truly be free of the terror that lurks in the shadows of the Alaskan wilds. Months have passed since I left the Alaskan wilderness, but the memories still haunt me. The faces of those lost, the creatures that lurk in the shadows, and the curse that binds them all linger in my mind. I've tried to return to normal life, but I know I'll never be the same. The darkness I encountered has a way of following you, even if you're miles away. I've made peace with the fact that some things are better left undiscovered, but the wilderness calls to me still. Perhaps one day, I'll have to finish what I started. Until then, I wait. If you've ever ventured into the unknown, you know that some places hold secrets better left untouched. But curiosity often leads us to dark places, places where the truth is buried beneath layers of fear and myth. If you dare to uncover the mysteries of the Alaskan wilderness, or if you think you can survive the terror that lurks in the shadows, share your own experiences. Comment below with your stories, and let's uncover what lies hidden together. But remember, once you step into the darkness, you may never return the same. Proceed with caution.